Vampire King pretends to sleep to test Maid's daughter and freezes seeing what she does. The castle of Kale, the Vampire King, loomed over the valley like a shadow carved from midnight. Its spires pierced the clouds, black stone glistening under the pale light of a swollen moon. Legends traveled faster than the wind in the human lands below, whispers of the king who had ruled for centuries, whose eyes could chill the bravest soul, whose hands could command the night itself. Yet tonight, the halls were strangely still. In a small, humble village on the edge of the dark forest, a girl named Elara adjusted the thin cloak over her shoulders. Her mother, a maid with hair as dark as her daughter's and hands rough from years of service, had pressed a folded letter into her trembling hand. "Go," her mother whispered. "Do not falter. The king tests all who enter his castle, but remember, your kindness, your courage, that is your shield." Elara nodded, though fear churned in her stomach like a storm at sea. She had heard the tales of those who entered Kale's castle and never returned. Yet there was something in her heart, an ember of bravery that refused to die. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was fate, or perhaps it was a magic she did not yet fully understand. The journey to the castle was long. Mist coiled around the forest paths like ghostly serpents, and the moon cast silvered shadows that danced across the roots and stones. Elara moved with care, each step deliberate, each breath measured. By the time she reached the massive gates, the wind had grown colder, and the castle's black windows stared down like the eyes of an ancient creature. The guards were statues in dark armor, motionless until Elara stepped into their line of sight. Their eyes glimmered red, and the hairs on her neck rose. Yet they did not speak. One raised a hand, and the gates groaned open, revealing a vast courtyard lined with statues whose faces were frozen in expressions of awe and fear. The moonlight shimmered off the fountains, the water black and still. Inside, the halls were quieter than the forest. Her footsteps echoed softly against polished stone, and her heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud in the cavernous silence. Torches burned with blue flames, casting long, flickering shadows that slithered along the walls. And there in the center of the grand hall lay Kale. He appeared to be asleep, or so it seemed. His black hair fanned around his pale face, and his long cloak sprawled across the cold floor. But the moment Elara entered, she felt it, an invisible pressure, like a storm waiting just behind calm clouds. He was watching her. She did not yet know it, but every instinct, every movement was being observed. She began her duties quietly, tending the torches, dusting the marble floors, and carefully arranging the furniture. Even in silence, she moved with a gentleness that spoke of kindness long unused in the castle's halls. She noticed the plants in the corners, their leaves drooping in neglect, and whispered a quiet prayer as she touched them, hoping to coax life back into their stems. Kale's eyes, though hidden, followed her every move. He had expected to see fear, hesitation, perhaps even lies in her demeanor. Instead, he saw a girl who treated the shadows with tenderness, who spoke softly to corners where no one else would dare to linger. He felt something stir within him, a sensation he had not known in centuries. Curiosity overcame caution. Kale allowed his presence to remain hidden, though the air seemed to shimmer with the weight of him. Elara moved through the hall, setting fresh water in the bowls for the spirits said to wander the castle at night. She hummed a quiet tune, soft and lilting, and the darkness around her seemed to lean closer, listening. The hours passed. Elara, unaware she was being tested, performed small acts of courage, straightening a fallen statue that seemed impossibly heavy, speaking softly to a trapped bird that had found its way into the hall, tending to the ancient library where the pages of books threatened to crumble. At the slightest touch, her care was instinctive, a reflection of a heart untainted by fear or greed. And Kale, still pretending to sleep, felt the cold walls of his centuries-long solitude begin to crack. He had ruled with power and intimidation, Yet here was a human girl whose strength was invisible, quiet, and yet far more potent than any sword or spell. She did not flinch at his aura, nor did she attempt to hide from it. She acted as if the shadows themselves were her companions. By midnight, the hall had grown colder. A faint mist rolled across the floor, curling around Alara's feet. She paused near the throne, a massive seat carved with symbols that whispered of ancient power. Something tugged at her heart, an invisible pull she could not explain. She knelt and laid a hand on the cold marble, feeling the history imbued within it. Her lips moved in a soft incantation, a prayer she had learned from her mother, a blessing for the night itself. Kale froze. He had never heard such a voice, nor seen such courage. In that instant, centuries of darkness pressed upon him, and yet he felt something he thought lost forever. Awe. His fingers itched to reach out, to touch, to protect. But he stayed still, silent, pretending sleep, allowing her purity of heart to shine in the hall without interference. Minutes later, a low rumble shook the castle. The torches flickered violently, and the shadows writhed as if alive. Alara's eyes widened, but she did not run. She whispered louder, her voice carrying warmth and light into the oppressive darkness. Slowly, the mist began to retreat, and the trembling of the stone seemed to calm. The plants she had tended leaned toward her touch, and the spirits that lingered in the corners bowed their ethereal heads in gratitude. Kale felt a sensation he had long buried, fear for her. Not fear of her, but fear for her. Something ancient and malevolent, awakened by the stirrings of her courage, had been quelled by her heart alone. He had intended to test her, to see if she could withstand the weight of the castle, the darkness of his presence. But he had not expected her to shine, to bring light into the shadows that had ruled him for centuries. She turned suddenly, sensing a shift in the air. Kale remained perfectly still, though the power radiating from him hummed like an unstruck chord. Her eyes met the throne, and for a brief moment she felt as though the room itself held its breath. And then she smiled, a small, genuine curve of lips, and returned to her duties, unaware that she had touched something deep within the king, something both fragile and powerful. Kale's heart, long thought frozen, ached with a longing he did not yet understand. The centuries of solitude, the countless nights of darkness, the cold emptiness of his immortal existence, all of it pressed against him, demanding attention. And all of it was wrapped in the image of a girl who had entered his castle with nothing but courage, kindness, and quiet magic. The first light of dawn crept through the high windows, silver streaks across the floor. Alara paused to watch it, feeling the warmth of the sun's touch despite the cold stone. Kale, still pretending to sleep, realized with a shock that he could no longer deny the pull she had on him. The instinct to test her further, to manipulate, to hold the upper hand, had vanished. Before he could act, a sudden tremor shook the castle, far stronger than the night's previous disturbances. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the torches guttered. Kale's instincts flared, and he realized the curse lingering in his castle was stirring again, an ancient shadow that threatened not just him, but the girl who had unknowingly brought hope to its halls. Alara's eyes widened in fear, but she did not falter. She stood tall, her small frame a beacon of courage amid the darkness. Kale felt a pang of admiration and of dread. He wanted to reveal himself, to protect her, but he stayed hidden, silently watching as she moved toward the trembling shadows. And in that instant, Kale understood. She was more than a maid's daughter. She was a force the castle had not felt in centuries, a light that could pierce even the deepest shadows. And if she survived, she would change everything, perhaps even him. The castle seemed to hold its breath. The curse, ancient and restless, roared somewhere deep in the walls. And Kale, the immortal vampire king, froze in place, not from fear, but from something far stranger. The dawning of hope, sparked by the courage of a human girl. The castle had not slept since Alara arrived. Shadows lingered longer than they should, whispering secrets of the centuries that Kale had lived in solitude. The walls themselves seemed to watch her, shifting slightly when she moved through the corridors. But Alara, with her quiet courage, was undeterred. Every corner she entered, every stone she touched, she treated with care, as if she understood that this castle, for all its darkness, was not cruel, it was only lonely. Kale observed from the high throne room, still pretending to sleep, yet every pulse of his immortal senses reached out to her. She had unknowingly disarmed centuries of caution and suspicion with nothing but her actions. Her gentle touch on dying plants, her soft songs for unseen spirits, and her bravery in the shadowed hallways. She had a strange power, a light that did not shine with fire but with quiet strength. By the second night, Kale decided to test her further. Not to harm, not to frighten, but to see if she could withstand the true weight of the castle, the weight of history, of magic, of lingering curses. He created subtle challenges, things that no ordinary servant would face. In the library, shelves shifted when she approached, threatening to trap her beneath them. In the garden, night-blooming flowers released a hallucinatory fragrance that could lull a weaker mind into dreams of despair. And deep in the catacombs, whispers of long-dead spirits tried to coax her into fear. Alara, unaware of Kale's watchful eyes, faced each challenge with an instinctive grace. When the shelves threatened to fall, she steadied them with careful hands. When the fragrance of the garden intoxicated her senses, she breathed slowly, grounding herself with whispered prayers. And in the catacombs, she spoke softly to the spirits, her words carrying kindness that they had not known in centuries. Kale, hidden from view, felt emotions he had buried long ago: admiration, longing, and something closer to wonder. He had ruled as a king of shadows, commanding fear and respect, yet here was a girl who neither feared him nor sought to manipulate him. She acted as if the darkness itself were part of her home, and in a way it had become that. Yet Kale's fascination was not without torment. He was a creature of centuries, shaped by betrayal, solitude, and power that had never been shared. To feel emotion for a human girl was dangerous, perhaps fatal to the control he prized so highly. He could not act, could not speak, could only watch silently as she moved through the castle like a beam of sunlight through endless night. Ilara, too, felt the pull of something she could not name. Often she would pause in the hallways, sensing eyes upon her, though when she turned, the halls were empty. Sometimes she caught glimpses of shadows shifting unnaturally, and her heart would quicken, not with fear, but with a strange curiosity, as though the castle itself were aware of her presence and responding. One evening, as the sky outside bled with red and violet from the setting sun, Alara found herself in the moonlit gardens. The air was cool, carrying the scent of flowers that only bloomed in darkness. She knelt beside an ancient fountain, its stone cracked and worn by time, and ran her fingers along the water's edge. A sudden rustle made her spin. Kale stood there, or perhaps a shadow of him. His eyes glimmered like black opals, catching the last light of the day. She froze, unsure if she had imagined him. "Do not fear," a voice echoed, deep and smooth, reverberating in the air yet carrying no movement of lips. It was not commanding, not threatening, it was simply there. Alara's heart raced. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but the voice itself seemed to hold her attention. And yet, in that moment, something inside her stirred, not fear but recognition. She felt the pulse of the castle through him, the weight of centuries and an unspoken loneliness she understood, though she did not yet know why. Kale tested her in ways more subtle now. He placed objects that required trust, like fragile glass figurines that, if dropped, could shatter and release whispers of the dead. He allowed small spirits to approach her, measuring her reaction. He was both judge and observer, yet each test revealed more about her strength than any measure of skill or bravery could show. Alara, moving with her gentle courage, never faltered. She treated every challenge as though it were a conversation, responding not with fear or defiance but with calm, steady grace. The spirits, the fragile objects, even the shadows themselves seemed to bend to her will, not through magic, but through the weight of her heart. Kale, watching, felt an unfamiliar ache. He wanted to reveal himself, to speak, to break the silent barrier he had constructed, but he did not. Part of him feared that doing so would shatter the spell of this human courage, that the fragile balance of trust and curiosity would collapse. And yet, with every act of kindness she performed, he realized that his centuries-long solitude could not withstand her light. Late into the night, Kale returned to his throne chamber. He allowed himself a moment of vulnerability, closing his eyes and imagining her near. He saw her face, her hair catching the moonlight, her hands gentle yet strong. A thought struck him with startling clarity. She could see through him, not to the mask of the vampire king, but to the man he had been before power had hardened his heart. Ilara, meanwhile, wandered the halls in quiet contemplation. She had begun to sense a presence watching her, but it no longer frightened her. There was something ancient in the castle's silence, a pulse that seemed to wait for her understanding. She touched the walls gently, whispered to the shadows, and felt a thrill she could not explain. She did not yet know the king was observing, but somehow she knew she was being tested. One night, as silver mist drifted through the corridors, a sudden tremor shook the castle. Torches flickered and the stone floors groaned. Kale rose swiftly, the pretense of sleep falling away in an instant. Somewhere deep within, the curse that had lingered for centuries stirred again. The shadows lengthened and twisted unnaturally, as if they sought to consume everything in their path. Ilara, hearing the disturbance, moved instinctively toward the source. Fear coursed through her veins, but she did not falter. She whispered to the darkness, her voice a soft lullaby, as if speaking to a frightened child. The shadows recoiled, hissing and swirling, yet she did not flee. Her courage was a light that neither the night nor the castle's curse could dim. Kale, hidden in the darkness, watched as she approached the source of the tremor. Every step she took was deliberate. Every word she spoke carried a strange authority over the restless spirits and the ancient curse. For the first time in centuries, he felt pride and awe in equal measure. She was human, yet she commanded the castle's respect without raising a hand in anger or violence. When she reached the center of the disturbance, she knelt, placing her hands on the cold stone floor. She whispered a prayer, soft yet filled with certainty, and a strange warmth spread through the hall. The shadows calmed, the trembling ceased, and the air grew still once more. Kale, frozen in place, felt his centuries of control slipping away. He had intended to test her strength, to see if she could withstand the darkness he had mastered. But she had surpassed every expectation. Her bravery and compassion had not only survived the trial, they had changed the very nature of the castle. Ilara rose, sensing the eyes that still lingered on her, though she did not see them. A faint blush warmed her cheeks, and she whispered softly to herself, "I only do what is right, what feels true." And Kale, from the shadows, realized the truth. She was no ordinary human. She was a force that could awaken hope, stir hearts long thought dead, and challenge the very darkness he had ruled for centuries. The castle seemed to hold its breath, the moonlight catching the edges of the towering spires. Kale's hand twitched, an impulse to reach out, to protect, to speak, but he stopped himself. He was not ready. Perhaps he would never be. But the awareness of her presence, her courage, and the gentle light she carried had awakened something inside him that had not stirred in centuries. As Ilara returned to her small chambers, she paused at the doorway and glanced back at the hall. The castle felt alive, watching, waiting, as if it understood that the girl who entered with nothing but kindness had begun a journey that would change everything. And in the throne room, Kale, the vampire king, stood alone. His centuries of solitude weighed upon him, yet for the first time he felt a longing that was no longer tempered by fear or pride, but by awe and an unspoken hope. A distant howl echoed through the night, a reminder of the curse that still lingered, and Kale knew. This was only the beginning. The castle of Kale shivered under the weight of the blood-red moon. Shadows stretched across the hallways like living fingers, twisting and shifting with a life of their own. The tremors that had begun in the nights past now roared through the stone walls, and whispers of a curse long thought dormant clawed through every corridor. Alara, standing in the moonlit hall, felt the tension as though it were a living thing pressing against her chest. She had grown used to the castle's strange, watchful presence. She understood now that it was not cruel, it was merely empty, waiting for someone who could fill the void with light. Yet tonight, even she felt the power of the darkness pressing too close. Kale had revealed himself fully the night before, no longer pretending to sleep. He had emerged from the shadows like a storm breaking the sky, his black cloak rippling, his eyes dark pools of centuries-old solitude. But the sight of her courage had softened him, revealing a vulnerability he had never allowed himself to feel. He had tested her, yes, but she had surpassed every expectation. And now the true challenge awaited them both. The curse, an ancient darkness born from Kale's own past, began to take form. It whispered in voices of the damned, swirling like smoke in the halls. Statues groaned, the stone cracking under invisible pressure. Torches flickered, casting shadows that writhed across the walls like living serpents. Kale's long fingers twitched, his body tense, but his eyes remained on Alara. He knew she would be the key to this battle, not his strength, not his immortality, but her courage and light. "Alara," he said, his voice low and commanding, yet tinged with something unfamiliar care. "You must stay close to me. The darkness will test everything." She nodded, her own fear present but tempered by trust. She had come to understand him in ways no one else could. She had seen behind the mask of the vampire king, glimpsed the man shaped by centuries of loneliness and burden. And despite the danger, she felt a strange calm. The shadows surged forward, a wall of darkness that twisted and writhed, taking shape in the forms of nightmares Kale had conjured in his own mind centuries ago. He raised his hands, but Alara stepped forward first. She spoke softly, not shouting, not commanding, but with the quiet authority that had already tamed the restless spirits of the castle. "Leave this place," she whispered, her voice carrying warmth and courage. "Go where you belong, far from these walls, far from us." The shadows hesitated, whispers faltered. The creatures born of centuries of sorrow and anger seemed to recognize her, not as a threat, but as a light they could not touch. Kale's breath caught in his chest. Her words had power, not magic, not force, but something far older, far stronger: compassion. The first tendrils of darkness dissolved at her touch, retreating like mist before the dawn. Kale stepped forward, placing a hand gently over hers. The warmth of her touch was shocking, almost painful after centuries of cold solitude. For the first time, he realized that the bond forming between them was stronger than fear, stronger than curse, stronger than any magic in his kingdom. But the darkness was not so easily defeated. It coalesced again, stronger, fed by memories of betrayal and loss that Kale had carried in silence for centuries. It roared through the halls, shaking the stones, threatening to swallow the castle whole. Alara faltered, the shadows pressing against her courage. Kale tightened his grip, his eyes darkening, not with anger but with fear for her. "You are stronger than you know," he whispered fiercely, though the words were not for her ears alone. "Do not let it take you." Alara nodded, closing her eyes. She took a deep breath and reached into the well of courage that had carried her through every trial. She thought of the quiet prayers she had whispered to the plants, the spirits, the shadows, of the faith she had held in kindness above fear. She did not raise her voice, she did not strike. She simply shone. The shadows hesitated, the whispers slowed, and then in a swirl of wind and light they began to retreat, unraveling like threads pulled from a tapestry. The curse's roar faltered, weakened by the purity of her heart. Kale felt his own power surge, but unlike before, he did not act to dominate the darkness. He simply stood beside her, lending presence, lending strength, but letting her lead. Together they walked through the heart of the hall, facing the darkness side by side. Every step they took, the shadows retreated further until at last the room fell silent. Only the moonlight remained, spilling silver across the cold stone floor. Kale's chest rose and fell with unaccustomed relief. He looked at Alara, really looked, for the first time without the mask of authority or the walls of centuries holding him apart. She was radiant in the moonlight, small yet unyielding, the embodiment of hope he had long thought impossible to feel. "You," he began, struggling for words, "you have done what no one else could. You have faced the darkness, not with power, but with your heart." Alara smiled softly, a blush warming her cheeks. "I did not face it alone," she whispered. "You were here with me." Kale's hand lingered over hers, reluctant to release the warmth that had been absent from his life for so long. The castle itself seemed to sigh, as if acknowledging that its centuries of shadow were finally meeting the light it had waited for. Yet the final test was not over. From deep within the castle's foundations, a rumble echoed, stronger than any before. Kale understood instantly. The curse was tied not only to him but to the kingdom itself. The ancient shadows were the remnants of a time when his power had been misused, when fear had ruled, when his own pride had bound darkness to the land. To break it entirely, he would have to confront the sins of his past. "Alara," he said, his voice steady but heavy with centuries of regret, "I need you to trust me. The darkness is not yours to fight alone." She nodded, placing a hand over his. She had come to understand that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stand together, even against impossible odds. They walked to the highest tower, where the moon hung like a blood-red sentinel over the valley. The winds howled, carrying with them whispers of old betrayals and lost lives. Shadows coiled around the tower, hungry for despair, but they paused when Kale and Alara reached the center. Kale raised his hands, and for the first time he allowed himself to channel the full extent of his power. The shadows surged toward him, seeking to overwhelm, but he did not fight alone. Alara's presence beside him, her courage and compassion, strengthened his resolve. He spoke to the shadows, not with anger or command, but with confession. He named his sins, his mistakes, his pride and cruelty, every act that had allowed darkness to fester. And Alara, her hand on his, radiated understanding. She did not judge, did not recoil. She simply shone with warmth, acknowledging the man behind the monster. The shadows hesitated, confused by this union of repentance and light. Kale, feeling centuries of guilt, allowed himself to weep, not with weakness but with release. And in that moment the curse began to unravel. The darkness screamed, a final roar of resistance, but Alara whispered, steady and calm, "You are not alone. Let go." The shadows dissipated like smoke, leaving only silence and moonlight. The castle trembled once more, then fell still, peaceful for the first time in centuries. The air was lighter, softer, carrying the faint scent of spring despite the night. Kale lowered his hands, exhausted yet transformed. He turned to Alara, seeing not a human girl in his castle, but the force that had redeemed centuries of solitude and darkness. "You," he began, voice husky, "you have changed me." Alara smiled softly, taking a step closer. "We have changed each other," she said. "The darkness does not belong to one alone. It belongs to all of us until we choose to face it." Kale reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, reverent, as if centuries of longing had found their anchor. "Then perhaps," he whispered, "we can face the future together." The castle seemed to hum with approval, the ancient stones no longer oppressive but alive with quiet joy. The curse that had haunted the halls was gone, replaced by something new: hope, trust, and a bond forged in courage and compassion. Alara looked up at Kale, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel truly human, even in his immortal form. Their journey had not been easy. Shadows, curses, and fears had tested them, but it had revealed something far greater than either had expected, that love, trust, and redemption could flourish even in the darkest night. And so, standing together in the highest tower, hand in hand, they faced the horizon. The blood-red moon began to fade, replaced by the soft light of dawn, and for the first time, Kale's castle did not cast a shadow over the land. Instead, it was a beacon, a testament to courage, to compassion, and to the bond between a king of darkness and the girl who had dared to bring light into his world. The castle would never be the same, and neither would they. But in that transformation, in that quiet triumph of hearts over shadow, they found something far more powerful than magic or immortality. They found each other.